Well, hello everyone. Welcome to week 8 of our EPM 4355 ISO 14001 standards, the Environmental Management Systems class. This week we're going to learn about performance evaluation. When we start with our Plan, Do, Check, Act framework, we see that we have left doing, support and operation. Now we're into performance evaluation, clause 9 of the standard. And so what we're doing is we have defined the context. Leadership has set up our direction given that context. We've had some plans. We've defined what we need to do in terms of supporting the actions necessary to implement those plans and what operations we're going to control, how we're going to control them. Now we're going to start checking on our actions. How well are we doing? How well are things going? So we're going to look at two topics this week. We're going to look at monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. And we're going to look at evaluation of compliance. We're going to again begin with some key definitions of monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation, and then look at the role that it plays within an organization. We're going to define the actual 14001 monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation requirements, and then how to document implementation of processes that meet those requirements and conform to those requirements. Next, we're going to look at evaluation of compliance and start again with some key definitions, describe its role in organizations, look at the actual 14001 evaluation of compliance requirements, and then look at some examples of how to document evaluation of compliance. So what are some key definitions for monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation? The first is indicator. And an indicator is a measurable representation of the condition or status of operations, management, or conditions. It's generally an indicator has a scale of some sort. Monitoring is defined as determining the status of a system, a process, or an activity. You can do this through checking, supervising, or critically observing. And measurement is a process that's used to determine a value. You measure something to determine a particular value. Performance is a measurable result of an activity. Performance can relate to either quantitative or qualitative findings. And performance can relate to the management of activities, processes, products, systems, or organizations. So performance is a very broad term. It can apply to multiple areas. Again, it can apply to activities, processes, products and services, systems, or organizations. And when we look at environmental performance, ISO defines environmental performance as performance related to the management of environmental aspects. What are the drivers of environmental changes, and how well are these drivers being managed throughout the organization? How are they identified, controlled, and improved? And for an EMS, results can be measured against a couple of things: the environmental policy, the environmental objectives, or other criteria using indicators. So this is why when we get down to the planning of the process, we are essentially laying out a plan for environmental performance in accordance with the policy, the objectives, compliance obligations, and other requirements, and providing an indicator that can be measured using some form of scale to determine where we are in our performance. Monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation has a very specific role in an organization. The first thing that it does is it implements the control function, provides for concurrent controls throughout the organization so that managers know what's happening. The information from the monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation can also be a feedback control. And so whatever management determines as significant in terms of significant aspects and impacts those can be monitored, measured, analyzed, and evaluated for improvement. Again, you can't monitor and measure everything in an organization. There's simply too much going on. This is why the significance of environmental aspects and impacts needs to be determined, and resources deployed to specific areas of environmental performance so that those can be acted on and negative impacts be reduced, positive impacts be increased, and aspects be reduced or eliminated. Monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation does assure alignment of the EMS in terms of the three forms of control: feed forward, concurrent, and feedback. And it can involve detailed operational measurements, equipment calibration, gallons of waste produced, tons of paper used, etc. And it will usually include environmental management and operational indicator measurement and monitoring. And so the type of indicators that are used are very important. This is where planning, again, comes in. And this is kind of an adjunct to planning. In other words, there are plans to achieve objectives, and then there's also operational control. So as we can see, there are three types of indicators that are used in monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. There's management performance indicators that provide information about management efforts to influence the environmental performance of the organization's operations, such as management actions, compliance status, training program implementation, that kind of thing. There's operational performance indicators that provide information about the environmental performance of the organization's inputs, outputs, that kind of thing. And then there's environmental condition indicators that provide information about the condition of the environment, like pollution levels and resource levels, that sort of thing. So there's three different types of indicators. So here's the requirements for monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. Remember, we're looking at performance evaluation of ongoing operations. So the organization shall monitor, measure, analyze, and evaluate its environmental performance by determining what needs to be monitored and measured, the methods for monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation to ensure valid results. Are they appropriate? Are these methods appropriate? The criteria against which the organization will evaluate its environmental performance and appropriate indicators. This is very important. When the monitoring and measuring shall be performed, and when the results were going to be analyzed and evaluated. A little kicker here is that the organization shall ensure that calibrated or verified monitoring and measurement equipment is used and maintained. And this is this is important because sometimes the definition of verified can be interpreted rather loosely. It's just best to get your equipment calibrated. The organization shall evaluate its environmental performance and the effectiveness of the environmental management system. Now, effectiveness means how well we're meeting our environmental goals. This is where the tie-in again to environmental conditions comes in. The organization shall communicate relevant environmental performance information internally and externally according to its communication processes and as required. So you're doing your compliance reporting plus whatever other communication you have to have as part of what you determine is necessary. And then you shall retain appropriate documented information. Again, the requirement for documented information is evidence of the results. So if we look at a way of documenting monitoring and measurement, we can see that this is one particular form. You can use this form on your final paper if you want, but this is really more, this is not really objectives related, although, well, it is objectives related, but it's really more around aspects and related to operations on an ongoing basis. So let's say that this information was set by determining the objectives as we did before. Now, this is important because we didn't really understand or didn't learn about the different forms of performance indicators before. But now, what you're going to need to do is go back and look at your objectives and your indicators and see, which are operational performance, which are management performance, and which are environmental performance. And so we can see here, we'll step through this. There's multiple aspects to transmission, rebuilding, and repair. So we have three objectives. First objective is to reduce the quantity of hazardous and non-hazardous waste. This is an operational performance objective. And then we have these three measurement indicators: pounds, and quantity of rags dry cleaned and reused. We have a management performance objective: use products with reduced environmental impacts. And the indicator is the number of non-hazardous products used as a percentage of total products used. And finally, we have an environmental performance: eliminate pollution of local waterways and contamination of area soil. The environmental condition indicator is concentration of nitrogen in Crinkle Creek and concentration of VOCs in adjacent land. So you can see here how the different forms of indicators are used, both to establish objectives and establish indicators related to those objectives. And this is on an ongoing basis, and so people are going to be checking it. They're going to get what date, who checked it, what the result was, and what corrective action was necessary. As we'll see later on, this will be tied back into the corrective action system. The lesson here, though, is that you should be using multiple forms of performance measurement indicators in your planning, in your final paper. So just learn about them, understand what they are, and make sure you've got everything that's appropriate based on your objectives. Here's another one. This is more of an indicator-based one. Pounds of refrigerant recovered, measurement method, use a calibrated industrial scale to weigh the pressure to weigh the recovery cylinder before and after filling, and equipment used. And then this is our record of equipment calibration. This is a very important verification. So compliance obligations. What are compliance obligations? ISO defines compliance obligations as legal requirements that an organization has to comply with, and other requirements that an organization has or chooses to comply with. Compliance obligations in an EMS are kind of repetitive, but they're related to the EMS. But they can come from multiple places. They can arise from mandatory requirements like laws and regulation, or voluntary commitments that the organization chooses to impose on itself, such as organizational and industry standards, contractual relationships, codes of practice, and agreements with community groups or non-governmental organizations. Industry standards might be certification programs for mechanics that you might want to consider those, and there's other industry standards of performance, the seal of good housekeeping, if you will. And so compliance obligations are not just regulations. They are both what's mandatory based on a regulatory analysis, and then what's voluntary as determined by management. Evaluation of compliance results in a determination of compliance status, and this is it's either you're either in or out, black or white, and can also prevent potential litigation, fines, and sanctions by providing a documented and verified method that was achieved on a certain date. And it's also another method for managing risks, similar to emergency preparedness or response. The evaluation of compliance can support budget allocations because it defines whether or not compliance has been achieved in a meaningful manner. It can support strategic and tactical planning priorities. Again, these priorities can be included into your objectives, as you will do in your final paper. It can involve internal or external requirements. And so compliance can be applied to organizational policies, performance plans, established procedures, required authorizations, applicable external regulations, relevant contractual provisions, professional certifications, federal, state, and local laws. So there's a number of different types of requirements that can be involved here. Management has to decide where they're going to draw the line in terms of what requirements are mandatory, what requirements are not mandatory, and what requirements will be ignored. It is what's required is that management establish a set of requirements, both internal to the organization and those adopted from external sources. So those need to be defined. The compliance status needs to be determined, and corrective actions taken when the organization is found to be in non-compliance. And this has been the role of traditional environmental managers for many years. This is why the EMS is so revolutionary, because it really is beyond compliance. There's many systems and processes that go way beyond simply complying with these requirements. The first one is that management determines what additional requirements might apply and plugs those into its compliance assessment processes. So what are the evaluation of compliance requirements? So the organization shall establish, implement, and maintain the processes needed to evaluate fulfillment of its compliance obligations. And this is relatively straightforward. Here's the requirement. Are we meeting it or not? And as part of this process or processes, you have to determine the frequency compliance will be evaluated, evaluate the actual compliance situation, take action if needed, and then maintain knowledge and understanding of its compliance status. So the documented information is the most likely source of knowledge and understanding of its compliance status. And this is normally done through compliance auditing. You're probably familiar with this if you've been in environmental management for a while. A lot of times attorneys will do this to maintain attorney-client privilege, although this can be integrated with the internal audit function. Here's one way to document compliance evaluation results. We state what the requirement is, who is responsible for meeting it, compliance check date, what the results were, what the possible root cause was, what corrective action was taken, and then what verification was done. This, again, can be part of your corrective action system. It doesn't have to be a standalone document. Here's another way to do it. We'll see this again when we return to the internal audits function. You just include the assessment number, a statement of the requirement and the problem, the date, with description of nonconformity or actual potential compliance issue, description of potential solution, the person responsible for corrective action, deadline, and then the completion of corrective action, what was actually done, what's the completion of corrective action, this section, what actions were taken, what results were achieved, and when they were achieved. And so this is the first part of this is what's the requirement, what's the problem here, what would fix it, who should do it, and then when it should be done by, and then what was actually done and what the results were achieved and by when. So that's it for this week's lecture. Ask any questions in the instructor office threads, or send me an email, or leave me a voicemail message. We'll see you online.